Tatars is actually an umbrella term that Orientalists and travelers, sort of your first kind of colonial travelers in our part of the world would use for all the people they didn't know how to categorize them. So everybody, basically the only people, these white men from this part of the world, or women sometimes, they knew Turks, they knew Arabs, they knew Persians, and then they probably knew Armenians and Georgians because they were Christians. Everybody else, they didn't know what they were. So they basically called everybody else Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Dagestani. They just said Tatars. So it's essentially it's a racist term in some sense, right?
Welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today on this series, we are talking with Slavs and Tartars, which is an art collective and a faction of polemics and intimacies devoted to an area east of the former Berlin Wall and west of the Great Wall of China, known as Eurasia. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So I have been a fan of Slavs and Tartars for a very long time. And I think the first time I spoke to you, which was not too long ago, I think I told you that. And one of the things that struck me about what you all do is you seem extremely comfortable in spaces that are undefined. And you almost seem to relish the fact that these spaces don't have clear definitions. Have you always been like that? And am I even onto something? Because maybe you're like, Mikey, you are completely off the rails.
No. I mean, I think we're off the rails, and that's if anything. But I think you're absolutely right. There's this in between space is really characterizes, I think, very much the region that we're devoted to. I mean, I think we spoke about it last time, but it's basically, if you ask anybody what's going on in Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan today, they're more likely to know more about what's happening on the planet of Star Trek than they are to know what's happening in Central Asia or the Caucasus. And what's strange about that is that it wasn't always the case. Actually, I would argue that our region has only been a remote or obscure region for the West only for the past century, right? That it was actually for the most of the past 2,000 years or so, at least, if not longer, it's been quite a central region for geopolitics, for the great game, the British and the Russians. But even, you could go back to, unfortunately, it's not just the West that views the region as something which is obscure. That's why I'm glad we're talking today, is that in some sense, I find bigger fault with our own communities. That is the Muslim world itself. When the Muslim world is defined, it's defined as Manasa, often using this kind of Cold War acronym. And the first thing that jumps to my mind is how can you forget Bukhara? And, it's the fourth holiest place in Islam. What happened to Baku, which was, the source of most of the world's oil until the Second World War? So it's one thing for, let's say, somebody in Kentucky not to know what's happening in Central Asia and the Caucasus. But it's a wholly other thing, I think, when the Middle East is somehow seemingly unconcerned, let's say.
Yeah. Even the idea of the House of Wisdom, for example, right? The House of Wisdom being in Iraq, right? As if it is an actual home filled with Iraqis by today's definition of what an Iraqi is. Whereas when you go down the list of all these thinkers who constituted this sort of the all-star cast of scientists and thinkers during that period, most of them are from Central Asia.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about the edges, right? Is that Central Asia was the eastern edge of the Muslim world, and I think you find something equally interesting on the western edge, Andalusia and Maghreb, and kind of these what the French call limitrophes, I guess liminal spaces. That it's where, it's the most interesting thing about these areas is that it's necessarily syncretic, right? It's necessarily you're by definition encountering others and forced to redefine who you are. And that's what makes it so interesting, I think, right? That in our region, let's say, it was the contact with Buddhists and Hindus and Confucianism, and of course a completely different set in Andalusia and Maghreb.
Are you interested in centering or recentering these liminal spaces, or are you trying to sort of decenter things entirely?
Yeah, I think it's more the latter. I think the very notion of center is, I can't say doesn't interest me, because I would say it's a sort of an unlearning that I've had in my own personal trajectory, in the sense that, I'm a product of large nations and their large capitals, whether it's sort of Paris, New York, London, etc. But I think very early on, at least in my early 20s, I could see that there's something rotten about the centers, and actually it's the edges which are much more heterogeneous, much more prolific, much more somehow more interesting. So ideally, I guess everybody, it would, to answer your question, I think it'd be more interesting if other spaces became liminal as opposed to us trying to center our space.
Yeah, you get some when you're on the coast, you get some more fresh air.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about 2006. So you launched, you and I think maybe co-founder is the right word. I'm curious how you think of yourselves, but you and a collection of people helped launch Slavs and Tatars. 2006, what were you doing right before this, where it sort of helped springboard this initiative?
Well, I had been working in different fields, journalism, media, sort of doing also private sector, public sector kind of research. But when we launched it, to be honest, we launched Slavs and Tatars. The idea was simply to publish a book or two a year. That was really the scope or the ambition of Slavs and Tatars, about things which concerned us or interested us about the region. We never intended it to become an artistic collective, and I think that's important in the sense that now, of course, we recognize and appreciate how much the art world, or the artistic discipline has given us. But it's also, it's important to understand that art is really one of the few areas that it accepts kind of orphaned projects that don't fit elsewhere, right? The kind of books that we're publishing, even Mullah Nasruddin, 4 or 5 years later, the translation of the Azeri political satire, that, we approach normal publishers, let's say normal publishers, sort of mainstream publishers, academic publishers, and they all didn't want to touch it. It was maybe too close to the Danish cartoon controversy or whatever, but it doesn't matter. Is that it's the art world that said, okay, we'll take a chance on these folks. And if I look back again, it's the reason why it developed so quickly, because I think I have to sometimes pinch ourselves that, within 5 years or so, we went from budgets of, when we started, we had like 50 euro budgets. We were just like doing pamphlets and small little sort of brochures, to having exhibitions in major museums within 5 years and much larger budgets. And I think it's very important to always understand the socioeconomic context of why things happen when they happen. And in our case, I think it's twofold. Is that one is that there was a desire to know about this region that was not being provided somehow, but also, to be very cynical, we were able to speak in an idiom that the powers that be in the West are able to understand. And what I mean by that is that you and I it's when you're looking for artists. Now, we've recently curated a couple of exhibitions. When we're looking for artists from our region, we're inevitably trying to resist the temptation or resist the urge to just simply choose artists who happen to be from our region, who studied in London, who studied in Paris, who studied in Amsterdam, who studied in New York. And the fact is that these places, they do allow a kind of, whatever you want to call it, they allow for one to converse in a language which is understandable to the centers of power. And again, this is to come back to your first question, is that that's why I think it's more interesting to decenter, because I hope that we're not always forced to speak the language of powers that be,
It's antithetical to a lot of the trends that are happening, at least in the Arabian Gulf and in the Arab world, which is like, they are primarily interested in recentering.
Yes.
Yes.
And Yes, and recentering, of course, means again, I mean, just the re, right? The kind of just the re in that is itself sort of is a bit of a downer, right? I mean, you don't want to re anything, you know. I don't want to return. I just you want to. A re is already kind of the kind of the leftovers or the what do you call it? The kind of the rehashed. So yes, it's much more much more interesting to think of new models, you know. And I think that it's much more difficult, of course, but much more interesting in the end.
So in 2006, you launched this idea of like, all right, we're going to publish a couple of books. This is going to be fun. Was the modus operandi fun? Like, this is just going to be fun. Let's have some fun. Or was there a deeper philosophical drive that sort of served to undergird the project from the very beginning?
No, there was. I mean, there was. It was definitely an element of fun, and I think that you see that in the kind of the.
Yeah, it's so fun. I mean, you guys are having so much fun. It's very obvious.
I mean, yeah, you can't. I mean, how do you live if we don't create some fun for ourselves? How do we get up in this increasingly sort of disastrous times of history? But no, I think the only serious thing about it was, and not the only serious, but let's say one thing we're very honestly very I find that we're actually blessed is that we started SLAVS TATARS as a way to teach ourselves about certain things. And that is, you know, it's important to say that because we're not in any way experts, and nor would we ever dare to position ourselves as experts on such a large region, right? You can't be an expert on a region that covers 1/6 of the land mass of the earth. So that's important because I think that's why, that's one of the main reasons I sort of ascribe to why publics in the general public, really, like the kind of your Turkish dentist, your Armenian engineer, your uncle, and who's not necessarily an art person, why they understand or engage with the work is that it's open-ended in the sense that it's not speaking at you. And I think that a lot of work, let's say a lot of what's considered political work in the arts over the past 40 years has been art that speaks at an audience, meaning that it tells the audience, this is what you should know, this is what you're missing, this is what you should be thinking about, this is what you should feel, you should be more conscious of. And we never, not by design, we just never believed that's just not the way we operate. We believe that it's we would like to introduce or sort of seduce or slowly draw you into things that we're interested in, and maybe you have things to add as well. And that open-endedness, I think, has been really the key to the fun. Also, like obviously that humor also is sort of is a way, is a kind of an icebreaker in some sense.
Yeah, I love names, and I feel like the first time I heard the term Slavs and Tatars, I was like, what is this about? It kind of sounded like a folk name to me, because I simultaneously had no idea what the project was and felt like I completely got it on every single level. Where did the name come from?
To be honest, I mean, in all humility, I think the name is the best work we've done over the past 15 years. Name. And I think that, and the reason why I'll sort of tell you a little bit about the name is that, first of all, let me answer the question. In 2006, it was a very different world to where we are today. And it was those 2 years after the 10 new member states had entered the European Union, right? So if you remember, there was all this sort of, it just sounds so quaint today in 2023 to talk about this kind of newspaper articles with headlines in London and Paris talking about Bulgarian plumbers and Polish builders taking away jobs. That was the concern of the European Union in 2006. So 4, 5, 6. Now, so we deliberately played with this idea of like, the first thing you think of, at least the first thing a Westerner thinks of when they think of Slavs and Tatars, often is a kind of horde of people coming to like rape and pillage. That was the kind of Braveheart kind of sort of a caricature, right? And that was definitely part of it. But the reason I like the name so much is, especially the Tatar part, is because it has all the elements of our kind of why we started Slavs and Tatars in that very word. Because Tatars is actually an umbrella term that Orientalists and travelers, sort of your first kind of colonial travelers in our part of the world would use for all the people they didn't know how to categorize them. So everybody, the only people these British explorers or whatever, Dutch, explorers, or adventurers, whatever you want to call them, these white men from this part of the world, or women sometimes, they knew Turks, they knew Arabs, they knew Persians, and then they probably knew Armenians and Georgians because they were Christians. Everybody else, they didn't know what they were. So they basically called everybody else Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Dagestani. They just said Tatars. So it's essentially it's a racist term in some sense, right?
It's like basically the Central Asian version of Barbar.
Yes, it is. It is. Exactly. And yet, the weird thing is there are real Tatars, right? So like, imagine if there were real barbars, like that would be great, right? Like there's people who are called barbarians, and then there's actually this really sophisticated culture called barbars. And this is the case with Tatars. There are real Tatars, obviously. And to make things even more, excuse my French, fucked up, is that there are Tatars of the Volga region, and then there's Tatars in Crimea and Krim, right? That are both Turkic-speaking peoples, but actually they're ethnically not at all related to each other, and they both use the ethnonym Tatars. So it's a fictive name and a real name, and yet it's a real name that is fictively used by real people. It's quite a lot in that, and I think that's what's so great about it, is that it has this element of like you said, like are they screwing? Is there are they serious? Are they not? You don't really know where to stand on it, and I think that's, to be honest, that's the holy grail as an artist is when you make work that you yourself and others don't know where they stand. Do I agree with it? Do I not? Are they being sincere? Are they not? That ambiguity is very difficult to maintain as an artist.
How do you balance that? I mean, that there's also, let me rephrase it. There's another dimension that you're operating on when it comes to humor. And that dimension is laughing with people and laughing at people, having people included on the joke and having people outside the joke. And in the art world specifically, often people are left outside the joke, right? That's kind of like one of the currencies that the art world tries to maximize, right? So when people walk in and they're like, I don't get it, they're like, oh, you don't get it, right? How do you guys balance it? Because I'm not an artist. I'm not from the art world at all, and I've never been from the art world, but I've always kind of felt included with your work. I'm also not an academic. And so but somehow I've always felt included. Is that intentional? Is that an intentional thing that you guys try to strive for? And if so, what's your secret? Please help me.
So it sounds like you're like our like kind of the perfect cyborg demographic, right? In some sense, it seems like from what you're saying. I mean, in the sense that, first of all, it wasn't calculated, but what you're saying is absolutely spot on in a sense. And I only realized it a couple of years ago, is that there's a kind of, everybody today talks about decolonizing. That's kind of the mot du jour is decolonize this, decolonize that, especially in our region, like decolonize Russia, which of course is long overdue. And to use that kind of term, we never used that term in 15 years.
Yeah.
And I think that if there's any kind of decolonization happening in our work, it's actually happening at the level of the audience. And what you just mentioned is exactly that, in the sense that, 95, if not more percent of contemporary art is built or is presented or is predicated on the notion that the public who comes to see contemporary art has an inkling of understanding of what art history is generally, right? Like 20th century art history somewhat, whether it's conceptual or a little bit of impressionist, cubist, just a little bit, just a vague idea. Whether they're in the art world or not, doesn't matter. But inevitably it's referring to that art, to that very discipline itself. Our work never refers to art history at all. And actually, so, what it does is by having an iron machine in a Kunsthalle in Hanover, or having a certain kind of topchan, like a riverbed, these kind of tachts that we have seating arrangements. So in a contemporary art space, what it does is it makes people like you and people like our peeps all of a sudden who've been left out of this conversation of contemporary art. Let's be honest, for the past at least 100 years, if not longer, 50 odd years, is that they immediately feel, okay, this is not foreign to me. This is not a space that's foreign to me. This is speaking even just behind me. A horseradish. When an Eastern European sees a horseradish, they say, okay, I get it. This is not pretentious. What is more simple than a horseradish? It's a root that costs nothing that you put into things to ferment. So that those that I think it's that insistence on having a kind of a set of references that is common to our region, that's important, because like you said, I mean, so much of art is about exclusivity, and if there is an exclusivity in our practice, it's not an intellectual exclusivity. It's actually it's simply like it's a kind of a reversal of the cultural exclusivity that has been operating in contemporary art spaces forever. Like if you think about art spaces, I've always wondered, like, why are contemporary art spaces so unfriendly? Even though they all talk about hospitality and being safe spaces, there's nowhere to sit. Go to it's like, for a Middle Easterner, right? Like there's nowhere to sit. The only place is actually in the cafe or the gift shop usually, or the lighting is like a kind of, you feel like you're a rat in a clinic, right? This kind of horrible white light. It's not a warm human space in that sense. And that says a lot. I think that, right? That those are just things that we thought, well, that's an easy thing for us to change, because we have to spend so much time with them as artists. And if we're going to like this time, if we're going to enjoy spending time in a different space, most likely our audience will as well,
Yeah, I had never, I'm like laughing because I've never even thought of that. But it's so true. And even just so many, now that you're mentioning, you've sort of like uncorked this idea, like so many design choices are made to make the person uncomfortable.
Yes. I mean, so much of art is, in general, I mean, there's always these kind of subtle points in, when you go to collectors' houses, there's always this element, right? Especially, and that's really where you see it, is that there's always kind of something in a collector's house that always will make you feel like, okay, you will not afford this. It can be a countertop that's made out of some crazy onyx that's brought from Madagascar. But there's so much about this is about exclusivity. And most creative disciplines, art, design, I think that it's something that they share. And that's the balance, right? That we're not interested in democratizing art necessarily. I'm not saying that it should be for everything, but it shouldn't be. I always come back to this great quote that in an article that Calvin, I think Tompkins from New Yorker wrote about C.R. Majani. They talk about the difference between accessibility and availability. And C.R. Majani says that, we should make work as available as possible, like a kind of really public works, right? That we're doing all this amazing work. We should make it as available economically, socioeconomically. But accessible is only depends on how much you put into it, right? Like, in our work, hopefully, you don't have to know everything about language politics of Eurasia to enjoy the work. You can just come in and chill out in the space, and that's a legitimate way to engage with the work. But like anything else in life, if the more you put into it, the more you read about it, the more you're curious, the more you'll get out of it. But there's no high barrier of entry.
Yeah. It's like a hike where you could like turn around at any point.
Exactly.
Okay, let's say somebody's listening to this podcast, so 23 minutes into the podcast, and they're like, but what do you guys actually do? Right? And imagine that person is like 75 years old, right? They're listening to it and they're like, okay, sounds awesome, but like, what do you do? How would you explain it to a 75-year-old who's not in this world at all, right? Like a retired Bulgarian dentist.
Well, usually the 75-year-old is actually also quite. The second question is, how do you make a living? Because they're so worried about us. Like, how do you live off of this? I'm very concerned, like a grandfather.
Habibi, how are you eating?
So the answer to the first question, I guess, the answer I usually give to make it easy is that we do everything but painting, which tells a little bit about the difficulty of the second question of how much money we make, because of course painting being the most profitable. But no, we do. I say that we do. I mean, we roughly do three things. We make art, which is with a capital A, things that museums commission, that collectors acquire, that galleries sell. Then we do books. We've published 12 books to date, and these are not catalogs. These are books about certain topics, which you just showed. For example, language politics as a political satire, or caricature. Mirrors for princesses, medieval advice literature, what have you. And the third element is the lecture performances that we deliver, sort of universities and art spaces that are on different topics as well. Now, how the three work together is that the books and the lectures are really like a conversation today. I hope you would agree. Is that they're accessible? They're accessible in their language. They're not. We never refer to anybody that you'd find in most sort of efflux sort of art world lingo. We don't talk about sort of philosophers of critical theory, etc. We don't name drop. So they articulate certain things. Now, the artwork, though, the challenge of the artwork is that it has to actually disarticulate that very thing that the books and the lectures are articulating. And that's where it gets complicated. And that's where I usually lose the older demographic is it.
Yeah.
Because disarticulation doesn't mean you stay silent. Disarticulating is a little bit like a loose thread in a sweater that you pull, it undoes the sweater. Art has to, in my opinion, has to undo the narratives, has to scramble the messages. It can't be clearly conveying anything. And that's hard because when you're as discursively minded as we are, when you're as research focused as we are, you want to convey things, you want to communicate things. You want to, I come from probably a similar kind of background as you in terms of our educations. We want to mediate, we want to excavate, we want to elaborate on things. But art can't do that. Art has to scramble things. I would say it better than that.
Yeah. Scramble things so as to require unscrambling.
Yes. So as exactly to kind of try to require the kind of the kind of awareness of the pieces and how they lie and how they work together and how they could be differently composed. Simple as that, kind of different.
So
different alternatives.
So the books and the performances are like the photo and the description of the completed castle. The art is like the Lego pieces broken up.
Yes, the art is like the kid just stomping on the castle right after he makes it. I mean,
it's like, no, it was just there. It was just there.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, hopefully in a productive way, but yeah.
Yeah. So let's continue with the 75-year-old. Okay, the 75-year-old, I'm going to role play. The 75-year-old says, "Okay, I think I got it. What's an example of this, of a disarticulation? What's an example of a topic that existed in all three of those spaces that you guys researched, you figured out how the castle looks, kind of. You figured out that the castle exists. You figured out the dimensions and the nature of this castle. And then you created pieces that get the viewers to realize, oh, these pieces are all over the place. And you scrambled it up. What's an example of a topic that you think illustrates those three spaces and those three productions?"
So, we've been so interested in kind of the fil rouge, or what do you call this, kind of this thread throughout our work is this concern of language and language politics in some sense. Now, part of this included looking to, one of the most interesting examples of alphabet politics is Turkey, right? That used the Arabic alphabet until 1928 and in Ottoman Turkish and then Latinized, Romanized. According to the Republican sort of Ataturkist, the last step that they went, they backtracked on, but they went so far as to translate the adhan, the call to prayer. And so from 1950, I think, or 1948 to 1950, for about 2 years, the call to prayer around Turkey was translated into Turkish. And so this is fascinating, right? Like, first of all, how do you even, just on a purely philological level, like how do you translate notions of monotheism and tawhid that are so important to Islam into a language or into a tradition which is pre-Islamic and actually believed in a kind of shamanistic great sky, right? So they, instead of Allah, they translated it into Tanrı, which is the Mongol Turkic, the Genghis Khan era of God. the kind of pantheist idea of the kind of the great sky. And so they translated into a local idiom. And what we did is that in our piece, which is called Ezan Çılgınları, which I'll send to you, or you can show it to you later, you actually showed it earlier in this kind of this rahle looking space with speakers coming out of it. We actually we created a rahle into the ground for the Berlin Biennale in 2014. Out of the hill, we just literally created a kind of a rahle and then had speakers coming out of them. So it looked like a kind of like a naturally built book stand. And from this was not this actually the one that was in the yellow this one exactly. This was built actually inside of inside of a landscape outside of a museum on a lake in Berlin. And the call to prayer was broadcast on this. Now, what I mean by this is that after all these years, I don't know, 2 or 3 years of research, I don't know how much time it took to make the piece, etc., to exhibit it, I can argue both sides of this debate, meaning that I can argue let's say the Orthodox Muslim side and say that actually language is not about transactional understanding. Sometimes it's good to have a relationship with the language which you don't understand, because that's how you access a certain metaphysical approach to, or a notion of divine, is that not understanding, right? This whole apocryphal, like Sufi ideas of, like Abu Bakr said, the highest form of perception is apperception, right? That actually you have to not understand to understand. Now that would be the Orthodox sort of saying. But I could also argue the other side, the kind of the secular side, saying that, well, why not translate the call to prayer into a language that people actually understand? You know, like why we're all interested in language, why not actually make that language accessible? So and then, you know, people that come to this, they don't know, again, are we critical of this translation? Are we even, you know, is this obviously it's not an anti-Muslim thing to do, but it could be interpreted as, by somebody who's very, very conservative, as something which sort of impugning on the honor of Islam, on the sacredness of Arabic as the language of Islam. But of course, it's done with such care and such, you know, there's no
malintent.
Yes, there's no excrement, or there's no nudity. There's nothing in an obvious way of being, let's say, irreverent about it, if at all. So you don't really know what side of that sort of debate you're on. And I think that is an example of, you know, all these years later, I still don't know myself where I stand on the piece. And yet I ostensibly co-created it, you know?
Yeah. Amazing. How does that look as a performance? Is it basically a lecture for you or whoever's doing it, sort of walking through all the historical facts and what you just did essentially, but fleshed out fully?
I mean, in the lecture, it's harder because in books and not lectures, I guess, let's say this ambiguity is possible in lectures. In the books, it's harder because as soon as you're using language, you can't take one side and take it opposite side at the same time. It's that tough to do in nonfiction. You can do it in fiction, maybe in poetry, but in nonfiction, it's hard to do that, right? To kind of to say something and to say exactly the opposite without sounding like a badly edited writer. In the lectures, it's a little bit possible because, let's say that there's a playfulness. The performativity of the lecture is actually in the way, as you mentioned, as the way we treat the material, in the sense that normally lecture sort of is linear. Ours are much more tentacular. So it's really like sort of, you know, like tentacles that are going outwards. And yeah, there's quite a lot of humor in the lectures that sort of challenges you to. I mean, my favorite episode is a piece actually that the Sultan, that actually is the collection of Sultan Al-Qasimi. It's one of our translator theses. He showed it from Venice, all these panels, and it's the to be or not to be that's written in Arabic, right? I think you showed the panels earlier on the wall, and you know, I show a T-shirt of it's one of these panels, but if you had an image of all the panels on one wall, I think earlier, but
it's okay. Don't worry about it. We'll get it.
So there's, you know, yeah, exactly. It's here in the middle. And I usually show a T-shirt, like a typical T-shirt that says, and you find in Amsterdam or American university campuses that say like to beer or not to beer, right? And that's what it is it's essentially a dumbing down or a kind of a gutting of an existential question, right? There's an existential question, to be or not to be. Somebody's made it into a stupid joke of consumption, like to beer or not to beer. And there's even a stupider one that says 2 beers or not 2 beers. And I say to myself, like, okay, so how do I bring back the existential gravitas to the question of to beer or not to beer? Well, one way you can do that is if you write in Arabic, to beer or not to beer, in Arabic script. For me, to drink a beer or not to drink a beer is not just a question of consumption. For the college kid from Milwaukee, maybe it is, but for me, it comes back to the questions of being, of belonging, of community, of identity, right? So it comes back to that kind of Shakespearean philosophical question. And I think that's this kind of swinging between high and low, between sort of sacred and religious. These are the kinds of, it's kind of whiplash that I hope that the audience experiences.
Yeah. Are any of the major questions that you're sort of unpacking questions that you have ever come to some conclusion about that you're like, okay, I know where I stand on this one? Or are all of them ones that you oscillate back and forth on?
I mean, no, well, then that would assume that all the works we make are very good works. I would say that none of the good works we made have I answered those questions. I mean, in terms of the questions themselves that stand behind, or the kind of that are at the outset of the kind of the journey that leads to a work. No, I don't think so. I don't think that. No, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
I can't imagine us. I can't imagine us being interested in something where we already knew, or where we would eventually get to the bottom of it. I mean, if you think about it, just look at the name of, again, the region we gave ourselves. We deliberately gave ourselves a region which we could never exhaust, right? Like, you can't exhaust such a large region with so many ethnicities. It's not a nation. It's a landmass. It's basically the whole continent.
Yeah. Can I talk about the we that you're talking about?
Of course.
Who's the we?
So SLAVS TATARS was founded by Kasia Korczak and myself, and she's a Polish national. In 2006, we founded it, and we were joined in the first 2 years by Victoria Camblin and Boyd de Vrijken, an art historian and a graphic designer, Belgian and American, respectively. And then they left the collective to pursue other careers and interests, and now we are joined by basically, I would say, 3 other people. Stan de Natris, who's a Dutch designer, has been with the collective for almost a decade now. Patricia Couvet and Anastasia Maruchina, a French woman and a Russian woman, who both live in Berlin. All of them live in Berlin. They run, Patricia and Anastasia run the Pickle Bar, which is an initiative we launched a couple of years ago, a couple doors down the street from our studio, which is a kind of a project space / aperitivo bar.
So I want to talk about the Pickle Bar.
Please.
How is this related to the rest of your work and your reason for existing? The reason why I ask this question before you answer this is because there are so many things I want to do related to afikra, right? There are so many, right? And I have a voice inside of my head. It's like, Mikey, this one, don't do this one. Like, it's a great idea, maybe, but maybe not. And for an idea to break through those negative Nancys or whoever they are, and to break through that many walls, it usually is a super solid idea. And I imagine that a collective like yours that is so creative would come up with a lot of ideas constantly. And so for an idea like the Pickle Bar to sort of be able to persist and actually come into existence, there's got to be a deeper sort of link to what you're trying to do. So what is that deeper link?
I'm very much personally inspired by the model of art patronage or engagement, activism of artists by a couple whose name was the Menil family. They're called the Menils, Dominique and Jean de Menil. They founded what's arguably the most important private museum in the world in Houston, Texas. They're French Catholics, and just situated a bit more closer to us and to our region. Let's say their daughter was she lived at de Menil, and she converted to Islam in the late 70s, and his name Faria de Menil. She's one of the leading Sufi sheikhs in North America, and they founded the Dia Art Foundation. Now, the reason why I mentioned them is that they just very simply said that the Menils always said, we do what others don't do. And I think that's very important is to not repeat, not go over again the territory, to do things which are distinctly different. And I think, and it's just, life is too short to do. And I think that's what I was saying at the very beginning of Slavs and Tatars, is if you think about so much of art discourse is actually talking about the same things, the same people, the same names, the same ideas. And I just thought that was a bit, we have to, there should be a different, and then even just knowledge production. If you think about how much, why is the philosophy department in Jeddah teaching the same things as the philosophy department in Heidelberg, which is teaching the same things as the philosophy department in Utrecht? That's just crazy. Like, why every place should have its own genealogy of knowledge? Why does everybody use the same template? And it's not a conspiracy. It's just, it's a lazy consolidation. People are just, they say, okay, this is successful. The Enlightenment, that was, that's clear genealogy. I'll go from Descartes to Hume to Hegel. Blah, blah. And I just think I find that's for me death. That's the definition of death, is this kind of very clear, mapped out cartography of resources, of names, and we're all going to talk about the same thing. So when a new idea like pickle bar, I think so the challenge is, how do you do things that others aren't doing and yet seem extremely obvious? That's the hard part, because like the kind of ideas when when you do them, you realize, oh man, I can't believe that nobody had done this before. This should have been done many years ago. And for me, pickle bar was like, why is every goddamn aperitivo bar serving red wine or like white wine spritzer, when I know that one of the best ways of drinking is clear spirits and fermented items? Like, that's just like, anybody who knows anything about drinking knows that cheese and wine is the stupidest way to drink and enjoy like a buzz. You should be having like, fermented young sort of half dill pickles and just a very little amount of vodka, and that you'll feel great. And that's a great way to kind of start an evening. Now, so that was kind of very basic levels. I come from actually hospitality and restaurant sort of family. So I was always thinking, like, why does that not exist as a model? Now to your point is that when you have an activity like yours or like ours, you can't take your eye off the ball too much, because you'll be consumed by that, right? Like, the last thing I want to do is open up a restaurant. That's just like, that'll just massacre Slavs and Tatars. There'll be no time for anything else. Now, so when we launched Pickle Bar, it was a little bit, again, a kind of response to kind of a midlife crisis of the collective, in the sense that when we started, as I said, it was 2006. We were young. It was a more naive place, I guess. 2016, 17, 10 years later, the world is a very different place. And also, we're not anymore the outsiders that we were in 2006. Like, we're no longer this kind of scrappy people. We have to you have to take responsibility for the recognition you have. And Pickle Bar was a way to do that, is that to say, like, okay, we will create a space where we'll redirect a lot of the resources and attention and intellectual or cultural and even financial capital that people are, very generously offering us, but we don't want to consume it ourselves. Because that's the thing about art, is that, in art, you either grow vertically or you grow horizontally. And most art grows vertically because so much of art is about the individual. It's about you, yourself. You have this kind of romantic idea. You have this vision. You want to finally do it bigger and bigger and bigger. That's not who we are. So we thought, how do we continue doing what we're doing, but not always us doing it? Like, not always me writing, not always me speaking, not always Kasha designing or creating the spaces or the artworks or staff. And Pickle Bar is a space where we what's fantastic is that we're like the MCs, we're the hosts. Like, we just We'll make the
Amazing.
setting. We'll give you the kind of the communication push, but you have the spotlight. You're on stage. You perform. We never perform at Pickle Bar as a kind of rule. It's not for us. It's for other people, really.
When did that happen? When did that moment of when did you feel comfortable shedding that skin? It's not a pivot. I don't want to say it's a turn, but when did you feel comfortable, or when did that moment of maturation happen?
In 16, it started. I would say in 16, we really had this. I say that's unjust, but it was a little bit of a crisis in the sense that we weren't learning as much as we were the first years of our practice, and so we thought, okay, something has to change. Again, without sort of pissing in the pot or biting the hand that feeds us, we're very grateful for the fact that we could publish so many books, that we could do so many exhibitions, but we weren't learning like we were in the first years. And so we thought, okay, let's just take a kind of couple of years and we did a retrospective kind of a survey show, but we done, kind of take stock of what we've done. And then we launched Pickle Bar at the same time around sort of, we started in 2018, 19, and at the same time we launched this residency mentorship program. And it really was and it was the same time we also curated our first exhibition in Ljubljana at the Biennial of the Graphic Arts. And I see these three things as very related, because curating, residency program, Pickle Bar, they're all about, in some sense, they're all a little bit like midwifing, right? It's all about providing a platform or providing a space for others' autonomy to support the agency and the autonomy of other people and not your own. And I think that's
they're nurseries.
Yes, and those things that I think, I guess it took us 10 years to get there. I think we needed. I think it was always there for us. We've never been sort of very self-involved artists. As you can see, none of our work is about our lives. There's nothing personal or biographical in any of our work. And also, we were always, to be honest, very, there's something extremely, as much as I've said several times, as much as I appreciate the art world, there's something extremely infantilizing about art, right? Like, as the artist, when you're the artist, you are treated like a child. Like, you're essentially like, everybody comes to you, oh, how was your train ride? How was a taxi? How was dinner? Is the hotel okay? Like, I'm a 45-year-old man who had a career before this. I don't need so much hand holding. I understand it comes from a good place, but it's also quite perverse, because you're not paid anything, right? Like, you're never paid for what you're doing. So you're really like this kind of child, or this kind of jester that kind of comes around, put your hands in your pocket, never take your hand off of the bill because you're not paid. So why would you offer anybody? Like, these are all anathema to a Middle Eastern person, right? So like, not pay for the bill. Can you imagine? Like, just sit there and like just expect somebody else to pay. That's hard to get used to, and it took us 10 years to bark back, let's say.
That is funny. This idea of, we will do everything except pay you.
Totally. Pay you properly. Because of course you're paid, but let's say for an exhibition at a major institution, you'll be paid 1,000 euros that you spent a year on. Where is that 1,000 euros going to go? How is that going to pay for more than half of a month of your rent,
It's really refreshing hearing you talk about this idea of recognizing the implications of your success. It's so refreshing. I had spoken to somebody not recently, a couple of years ago, who also exists in the art world, who almost had a huge blind spot about the success that they had, and they had been in the game for sort of like 15 years. And they're like, we were outsiders. And I'm like, I don't think you are anymore. I don't think you are anymore. And that's not, it's almost disingenuous to believe that.
But to be fair, I mean, not but also on a national level, I think about this a lot, especially like vis-a-vis, Eastern Europe and Eastern Europe's track record on accepting refugees. You remember during everybody's talking about it now. Of course, the Poles didn't accept any Syrian refugees, but then they opened their doors entirely to Ukrainians, right? And then everybody talks about, how there's a kind of double standard vis-a-vis white Christian refugees as opposed to brown Muslim ones. Now, this comes back to this, this idea of recognizing the responsibilities. It's, to be fair, I'm not saying justifying it, but basically when you're, as an artist, and as a nation, like the Poles who didn't exist for 200 years, it's very easy to put yourself always in a victim or and as an artist also, you're always in the position of it's never enough. You're never going to be recognized enough. Let's put it that way. No artist will be recognized enough. Even the biggest names are, I'm sure you go knock on their door, they still feel they have a chip on their shoulder because this, it's never enough.
Kanye West doesn't think he gets enough credit.
Exactly. That answers it exactly. So, if there's no such thing as enough, then you have to start the question. Yeah, exactly. It's like, what do I have that others don't? And, we don't have resources, but let's say that we can share with everybody. I'd love to be able to pay people a lot of money to do things, but we do make sure people are paid properly at Pickle Bar and the residency. But more importantly, we have, what art has is social capital, right? Like we have a certain kind of cultural capital that again, it's hard to pay a rent on, but if I can at least share that to help build other people's careers so that they can then ask for the right amount of money when they're doing their things to be paid properly, then why not,
Yeah. This is an aside, and this is like the least cool thing to say, so I fully understand that it's not cool, but I'll just lean into it. I was recently watching this interview with John Mayer, the musician guitarist.
I don't know.
He's like a early 2000s teen heartthrob who revealed himself to be this guitar virtuoso. He's a singer-songwriter type character. He's an incredible guitarist, incredible guitarist, as a jazz guitarist and all these different things, who has garnered insane popular success, multi-platinum, one of the sort of best pop songwriters of his generation. And recently, or maybe 6 or 7 years ago, in an interview, he was saying, I just wish I could join somebody else's band. I just want to join somebody else's band. I'm sick of my songs. I just want to join somebody else's band and go on tour with them. Just go on tour with them. And so he ended up joining the Grateful Dead. Have you heard of the Grateful Dead?
Yes, that I know, of course.
Okay, so he joined the Grateful Dead and has gone on tour. Every single year he goes on tour with them, every single date. And so he basically was locked himself in a room, learned 200 Grateful Dead songs out of a frustration that he wasn't learning anymore. And he was like, I've done this before. I know my songs inside out and I'm not learning enough. I just want to be a player in an excellent band and learn tons of music and do this cross training. And since then, he's still doing his own thing and publishing his own music. But that midlife crisis, I feel is so relatable that the professional midlife crisis of I got to go do something else. And it's nice to hear that you guys kind of landed on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest,
that
resonates in the sense also that in the past couple of years, we've done a couple public commissions where we did one for an institution in Germany, West Germany, in Osnabrück, and recently in Frankfurt, where we basically went and took a kebab shop and essentially redesigned or every touch point you have, from the signage to the placemats to the envelope that you put the donor in. We revisited it, reconsidered, redesigned it, rethought it, and the reason why is that is first of all, to come back to we're talking about this kind of this homogenization of art culture in the West. Germany, Germans, of course, Germany is a place where the doner kebab was founded, and yet Germans don't, and they're everywhere, but Germans don't consider Turkic cultures to be high culture like their own, or like the Italians or like the French. They don't consider it to be a place of literary nourishment.
Nor do they consider it to be German food.
Nor they consider it German food, exactly. And I think that, so we thought, why don't we, and it's a little bit like what you said about this John Mayer, is that we thought, well, how can we as artists go in and make an existing experience better without calling attention to art? Putting ourselves in the position of a service industry. And I say this a little bit provocatively. I taught a course this past term at this art school in Frankfurt. at the Shedowshul, and it was called service industry. And it's a bit provocative because artists are taught or kind of raised with the idea that art is autonomous and that art is not in the service of anybody. And it's nonsense. It's naive. We're all in some service industry. You are, I am, my restaurateur parents are. It's just a question of who are we serving, whom are we serving, and how are we serving it, right? And I think that there's something to be said that of art somehow. How does it maintain its transformative qualities, or can it maintain its transformative qualities, and yet actually in the service of something else is quotidian as a fast food doner shop? Like that's the lowest thing on the food chain compared to like art, which is considered to be sort of high end. And I think it's I mean, it's a very Sufi idea, right? This idea of annihilation of the self, right? It's fanal nafs, it's like it's idea that you get to a point in Buddhism as well that you and I think that that's with age, hopefully we all get there in the sense that we understand that the work we're doing is not about us, the work really, right? It's like the work has to be able to exist and live and breathe without all of our anxieties and our desires and our insufficiencies and our, envies and nods, all of us, which is just so, I'm not a big believer in, I don't know, individual sort of neuroses, biography. I just think it's a bit boring.
Yeah. It's like, it's as if you are the egg, you're the eggshell around the egg, and the egg is like the idea or the truth. And you're like, just peel off the shell.
Oh, totally. Just make the omelet.
Just try to remove yourself as painlessly as possible from this process. Before we wrap up, I want to do the quick Q&A.
Sure.
So what are you reading or watching these days?
Yeah, I'm reading a book called Communities of Violence, actually, and it's by a gentleman named Nuremberg, and he basically takes his medieval idea of I think in southern Spain during times of the Moors, and basically says that we believe that somehow multiculturalism today is that we've been brought up to believe that multiculturalism is all about harmony amongst sort of multi-ethnic, multi-confessional societies. And he just shows how some of the most multi-confessional, multi-ethnic societies in history, more than any of ours today, always had these sort of outbursts of violence, and that it's actually important to understand that there needs to be channels for this kind of enmity or hostility to come out, whether it's, again, through jokes or through satire or through actual violence as well. But the idea that somehow we're all sort of holding hands, it's a small world is extremely naive, and it really never existed in history.
Can you say the author's name again?
Yeah, his name is Nuremberg. The first name is, I have it right here, called Persecution of Minorities in the Middle Ages by David Nuremberg.
I'm getting this book for sure.
And I'm watching Bear, the second season of Bear.
Oh yeah, cool.
I would say Sergei Maslov. He was a Russian Kazakh painter who was really out there doing like really crazy, fantastical, cosmic, kind of sexy paintings, but also was convinced that he was in a relationship with Whitney Houston, even though he wasn't.
Really?
And, yeah. And the paintings I have to show you. And he wrote letters to Whitney Houston, and then wrote letters answering himself back from Whitney. And they're just, it's amazing. The guy's, I don't know what he was on, but there's letters where Whitney Houston sort of says, "Dear Sergei, I just discovered, thank you so much. This is when Whitney Houston's being domestically abused by Bobby Brown, saying, and just thank you for your kind words about my husband. I know I'm trying to get free of him, but I just learned, Sergei, that even though you're from Kazakhstan, you're a Russian from Kazakhstan, which means you're white. And I don't know if you know, but I come from a family of like a lot of black power, and I cannot be with a white man." And he's writing all this stuff as if it's Whitney Houston writing to him to kind of reject him. And
wow.
It's the paintings are really out there. I'll have to share some with you.
Yeah. He's
dead. He died in the 90s.
He's like, "Dear Sergey, I just want to dance with somebody." Super interesting. Okay. What do you think people most misunderstand about your work?
It took me a long time, like 35 years, to understand that, to understand the lessons of Mullah Nasruddin, right? The Hoja Nasruddin, the Joha. And that, what I mean by that is that I think Mike Kelly, the artist, the American artist who passed away a couple of years ago, said that, the problem with most contemporary artists is that today, again, about artists talking at people, today, so many artists want to be the smartest person in the room. And I think that he said the role of the artist is to be the fool, right? Like Nasruddin.
The jester.
The jester. And the thing is, of course, if you try as an artist to convince people that you're an idiot, there's a good chance that you'll succeed in convincing some people that you're actually an idiot, right? So, when in some of our works, as you've seen, like when we have a poster that says, men are from Murmansk, women are from Vilnius, you're asking for people to say, like, these guys are just purely silly sloganeers. It's a one-liner. There's nothing
to beer or not to beer.
To beer or not to beer. You're asking for them to take you at face value. And of course, I can't blame them because we were asking them to do that. But I think that for me, the great thing is that I think that there's always a lot of depth in the surface. I hope there's a lot of depth in that surface.
I love it. Okay, since you're not prepared for these, I'm going to change the last question.
Sure.
The last question is, what advice would you give your 12-year-old self? And what would that 12-year-old self give you as advice?
This is an easy one, funny enough, because I think about it a lot. I think about this a lot because I recently had children, and given my interest in language acquisition, I think it's very interesting that we're asked to learn foreign languages at an age where we don't understand the implications of what that decision will make, will have on our lives. Meaning that, you're 13 years old, you're 12 years old, 13, in some countries 12, 13. In middle school somewhere, you're said, okay, it's time to choose a foreign language. I was in Texas in 1986, I guess. I was 12 years old. 1988, I chose French. For whatever reason, right? Like, why? Like, why would a 12-year-old in Houston, Texas, none of whose parents speak French, go against the grain of everybody learning Spanish? And of course, I was playing football, so everybody on the field, on the pitch, is speaking Spanish. Yeah. Why did I choose French? Now, and I think about this a lot because later, again, it happens to you when you're 18, you go to college, choose another language. And then, you don't realize it. For me, languages are a little bit like, I like to describe them as almost like homeopathic pills. Like they have a delayed time reaction, right? It's like a delayed time bomb. You don't realize, I never would have known choosing Russian at 18. I thought I was just going to go to Russia for a year as an exchange student, come back and tell my kids when I'm 6 years old, my grandkids, I spent a year in Russia, blah, blah. I never knew I'd spent 5 years living in there, that all my work would be based somehow between this kind of basically Muslims of the Russian world, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So to answer your question, the regret I have is I didn't learn Arabic at age 18. When I went to college, I was asked to learn a foreign language. Arabic wasn't even on my list. And I could blame everybody else and say, it's because I was raised in a typical kind of Iranian household where Arabic wasn't a secularized Iranian household, where Arabic wasn't considered deemed to be worthy, somehow wasn't noble, which is of course nonsense, because if anybody knows anything about Iranian history, we know the interconnection of these two languages. But no, I mean it in a sense that I would learn. I would learn Arabic, and I would pay more attention to smaller peoples. And what I mean by that is that, I recognize my weaknesses. My parents are from Iran. I was born and raised in the States. I lived in France. I studied in the UK, in Russia. It's all these major countries. And I think that the problem with these major countries is that they're all really unhealthy because they all have this incredibly inflated sense of themselves. They just can't accept who they are, and they all look down upon all the smaller peoples around them. The Russians to the Georgians and the Ukrainians, the Americans to the Mexicans and everybody else in Middle America and Central America, the Iranians to the Azeris and the Uzbeks, and it just goes down the line. I think I would wish my 12-year-old self a bit more confidence to learn more about smaller peoples and not so obsessed with the kind of the big boys.
What's the second answer? What's the answer to the second part of the question? What advice would your 12-year-old give you now?
Patience. I think patience, probably.
Yeah.
Somehow learn more patience.
Okay. Amazing. If anyone's interested in finding more about all of the incredible work you do, it's Slavs and Tatars on everything. So SLAVSANDTATARS. Man, thank you so much for doing this. I have been really inspired by your work for so long. So it is an honor to have you on the series.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, I enjoyed the conversation very much.